The development of Pokémon as a series and all the stories that make it up is one of the single most fascinating things in the world to me, and I wholeheartedly mean that. Recently, you may have seen Did You Know Gaming release a video on some new discoveries they had made about Pokemon's early development via some interviews they had translated. Well, while what they covered was great, and you definitely should check it out if you haven't yet, I also read through all of these interviews myself and found some more stuff that they didn't cover in their video that I thought was really interesting and therefore is what I am here to cover today. A big shout out goes to both Did You Know Gaming and Dr. Lava for translating these interviews and making them more available and well known in English. So links to each of them will be available in the description, which you definitely should check out. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. The first piece of information I am going to cover here comes from an interview that was included in a 1996 Japan exclusive book known as Pokédex. Did You Know Gaming have highlighted this book themselves in the past, and now an interview from the book featuring Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri, as well as other members of Game Freak's staff, has been translated by them as well. In the interview, Tajiri actually says that the player being able to name the actual Pokemon species themselves is something that was actually considered at one point, and apparently was only scrapped because of the limitations of the Game Boy. Tajiri said, quote, "At first, we thought of letting the player name new species they discovered, but the Game Boy has its limits, and yet we didn't want to give up on the idea." He goes on to say that this is actually what later inspired the feature of nicknaming Pokemon, saying, quote, "That concept evolved into being able to nickname your own individual Pokemon. In the middle of production, we conducted a poll, and many wanted to be able to do that. I think it goes without saying that each Pokemon species being named by the player themselves would have been an absolute madhouse, and wouldn't have allowed Pokemon to become the brand it is today with none of the Pokemon having defined names. If you can believe it, however, this feature could have potentially sabotaged Pokemon's popularity in other ways too. I mentioned in a past video on Pokemon's early development that the oft-requested feature of multiple save files was actually going to be in Pokemon Red and Blue, until it was cut due to Game Freak's desire for the nickname feature, and the lack of cartridge space to be able to include both. But this wasn't the only thing that nicknames nearly took away from us. In this same interview, Tajiri said that the team was so set on nicknames that they were willing to only have 30 Pokemon in the game so that it could be done. He said, quote, "Implementing the nickname system meant we'd have to reduce the number of Pokemon you could collect. We had about 100 designs we were attached to, but we would have to cut it down to 30. And yet, people really wanted to nickname their Pokemon, so we gave up on having more than 30 Pokemon." Now, I know that people love their nicknames, but as someone who never nicknames their Pokemon, just out of personal preference, I can't imagine a worse trade-off than cutting out at least 70 Pokemon from the game just so that nicknames could be included. However, that is not ultimately what happened, of course, because it was Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto who actually saved the day by providing Game Freak with cartridges that had more memory, so that the nicknames and Pokemon could be included. This is something I've also touched on in another video, but without the added context that the low number of Pokemon was in part due to Game Freak being insistent on the nickname feature. In the end, it's very fortunate that none of this ended up happening the way it was planned. When it came to Pokemon Red and Blue, it wasn't just gameplay features that ended up on the cutting room floor. Since the series' entire identity was literally being conceived while these games were being made, lots of ideas were considered, and one very interesting one that came to light in these interviews was the idea that Pokemon's world wasn't originally conceived as just a bunch of routes and towns, but more so like an open-ended world, similar to something like the original Legend of Zelda game, where the player can go anywhere and head in any direction. Speaking in a more recent interview coming from the May 23, 2019 issue of Famitsu Weekly, longtime series director Junichi Masuda spoke a little bit on Game Freak's history and the development of Red and Blue, and mentioned this idea of a less constructed world. He said, quote, "The biggest obstacle was finding ways to overcome the capacity limitations. In order to fit all the Pokemon data, we had to make some cuts in other places. One of those cuts was the road system that connects the towns. We decided it wasn't necessary to make the entire map one huge uninterrupted landmass, so we cut them up into small maps connected by gates." Satoshi Tajiri also touched on this part of development 23 years earlier in his aforementioned interview from the Pokédex book, saying, quote, "We thought about how the real world we experience is made up of local roads, highways, and lots of named roads that connect towns and cities. We figured, well, why not make a game like that? And that's how we designed Kanto. This also had the advantage of making it so we didn't have to fill in every inch of the map, the way we would have had to otherwise." So it ultimately sounds like Kanto's map was a result of limitations, but it was also the kind of cut that Game Freak were okay with making. It would have been very interesting though had Pokemon Red and Blue's world been more Zelda-esque, but it ultimately of course did work out for the best, and coincidentally, almost 30 years later we will actually be seeing a Pokemon game with that style of world, with the release of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet later this year. Along with the gameplay and world of Pokemon Red and Blue, the story is also something that changed over time. While story is never a huge focus in Pokemon games, and certainly isn't in Red and Blue, the plot of these titles is iconic nevertheless. Everything from beginning your journey in Pallet Town, to battling Team Rocket, to the background of Mewtwo and its creation, to even facing your rival as the champion, the story itself is a great one, even if it's not super narrative driven. However, the story we got in Red and Blue apparently wasn't always the one we were intended to get. It is mentioned by both Junichi Masuda in that same Famitsu interview from before, as well as the Satoshi Tajiri biographical manga that came out a few years ago, that a different story was once in place for Pokemon Red and Blue before Tajiri rewrote the entire thing by himself, due to feedback that he received from now Pokemon Company CEO Tsunekazu Ishihara. On the subject, Masuda said, quote, "Ishihara also gave us some pointers on the story and setting. At first, someone else was in charge, but it wasn't the direction everyone else wanted, so Tajiri revised all the story stuff himself, and the final result was fantastic." The manga goes on to say that Tajiri spent 6 months reworking the plot entirely, and this is where the concept of people living and growing alongside Pokemon more closely eventually came from, which of course is a huge part of the series' identity. However, these sources don't actually give us any insight about what that former story was like, but based on what we do know about Pokemon's development and all that was considered, it appears as if it could have possibly had more of a Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy type of feel to it, which actually makes sense considering the Final Fantasy Legend game for Game Boy was a big influence and inspiration on Pokemon's early development. It would certainly be interesting to learn more about this someday, as the idea of a Final Fantasy-like Pokemon game is fascinating to say the least, but in the end, the new direction obviously worked out for the best. And there you have it. That was just some of the insane cut content from the earliest days of Pokemon that recently has been unearthed. Once again, a big shout out goes to both Did You Know Gaming and Dr. Lava for providing these translations. Links to both of their stuff will be in the description below. If you guys enjoyed the video as well, be sure to leave a like and let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you are new as well. Also, just so you know, I am conducting a Pokemon Scarlet and Violet giveaway via my Spotify if you're interested. All you gotta do is listen to my Pokemon remixes over there, and for every 3,000 new listeners we get by the time the game's release, I will be giving away a copy. So check that out if you're able to, because it is also just very much appreciated in general. With that said, I will be back with another video very soon, and until then, as always, thank you all so much for watching this one. I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.